Materialism. Now, I want you to know I did not plan this. Okay, I started going through Luke, and you know, talking about materialism right before Christmas just seemed kind of either appropriate or very inappropriate. I'm not sure which. Um, but as we get into it, I think we'll see that I think it's a very appropriate topic. When I came home, and Allison always says, "Well, what are you preaching on next week?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to preach on materialism." She said, "Well, don't just try to make people feel bad because they have stuff." Oh man, I'm going to have to go plan another sermon. Um, but I don't think that's the whole point of the Bible's discussion of materialism. And let's get into it and let Jesus talk to us this morning. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide his inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Man, who made me a judge or an arbitrator over you?" And he said to them, "Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness." Now, there's a word that is English, but that we don't use very often. When was the last time someone told you, "Don't covet that"? I mean, it's just not a word we use very much unless we're in church, and so I often feel like we need to sort of define that. What does coveting mean? Well, some would say desire, but there's a lot more to it. Coveting is desiring something that doesn't belong to you. Coveting is looking for ways to get things that don't belong to you. And it is one of the 10 Commandments that you are not to covet. You're not to desire things that don't belong to you. And so we need to understand that when we read the Word. It's not just saying you can't want things. We all want this and that and the other. But it's looking towards something that actually does not belong to you. That is what coveting means. Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. Now, that is a message that I think most Americans desperately need to hear. But I have found, traveling around the world, that almost everybody needs to hear that. See, I was a little surprised. We got over to Kenya, into a third world country where the average person makes about $1 a day. And the biggest problem we had to work with in the cities is materialism. People came to town to get rich and go home and show everybody how rich they were. And how much rich is in various countries is pretty subjective. People who are poor in this country, and we have poor, but those very people would be considered very wealthy in other countries and other places. And I think it's ironic and very appropriate that when Jesus says, "The poor you will always have with you." Now, why does he say that? Does he think that's a good thing? Is he saying that's something we should just sort of accept? The fact of the matter is, as long as there are haves and have-nots, you're going to have rich and poor. And again, that's a relative thing. Because I'll tell you, poor here and poor in Kenya is two totally different things. Resources available to us in our country, even to homeless, is greatly exceeds what's available to an average person in Kenya. And I pointed out in class this morning, the Kenyans were doing better than every country around them. They were actually, I often like to tell them how rich they were, which they didn't fully appreciate either. I was the rich guy, not them, And so we need to understand that. One's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions or her possessions. That's not what makes us who we are. What's that? The difference between the men and the boys is the cost of their toys, or the size of their toys, or whoever dies with the most stuff wins. And you hear stuff like that, and you're like, that's not really what's going on. We need to understand that. One's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. And he told them a parable, saying, "The land of a rich man produced plentifully, and he thought to himself, 'What shall I do? For I have nowhere to store all my crops. We'd call that a good problem to have. And he said, I will do this. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. Sounds good, doesn't it? But God said to him, fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. And he said to his disciples, therefore I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat, or about your body and what you will put on. For life is more than food, and the body is more than clothing. Consider the ravens, they neither sow or reap, they have neither storehouse or barn, and yet God feeds them. Of how much more value are you than birds? And which of you, by being anxious, can add a single hour to his span of life? In fact, all indications are that it'll shorten it, not lengthen it. If then you are not able to do as small a thing as that, why are you anxious about the rest? Consider the lilies and how they grow. They neither toil or spin. Someone should write a song like that, right? Yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass, which is alive in the field today and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, how much more will he clothe you? O you of little faith. And do not seek what you are to eat and what you are to drink, nor be worried. For all the nations of the world seek after these things, and your Father knows that you need them. Instead, seek his kingdom, and these things will be added to you. Fear not, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to the needy. Provide yourselves with money bags that do not grow old, with a treasure in the heavens that does not fail, where no thief approaches, no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. We first deal with inheritance. Someone in the crowd shouts at Jesus. He thinks he's a good leader. He seems fair. He's all about justice. And so he says, Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. You need to understand, according to the law of Moses, the firstborn son got twice what everybody else did, any of the other sons. That was just the law. Now, if you're a firstborn, you think, well, that's about right. And if you're not, then you're kind of having a little trouble with that. Some people say, well, it's because the firstborn had the hardest job or because he had to help raise the other kids. We don't know. That's just what's in the law. And so you can imagine this guy talking to Jesus is probably one of the younger brothers who doesn't feel like he's getting a fair share. He may be saying things like, the law of Moses was written a couple thousand years ago. I mean, that's an old document. Why are we still going by that? Sound familiar? He's probably got some issues with the law, with the way things are being distributed. And that becomes a problem as you have less and less land. It does become an issue. But he goes on to talk to them about this idea of, again, wanting something that doesn't belong to you. If this kid grew up in Israel, if he grew up a Jew, if he grew up reading the law, he was well aware of the law and should have had his expectations where they were. He will get half of what his older brother might get. So he tells this great parable of the rich fool. And it's one of those stories again. We know if you've been around the church, you've heard the story, you know the answers. And so I'm going to ask you to step out just a minute and try to read it as if you don't. I know it's hard, but the fact of the matter is, when we just look at this as Americans instead of, BRC squared Christians, born and raised, it seems he's just being shrewd with his bumper crop. He hasn't abused his servants. There's no evidence that he was, somehow unscrupulous in his business dealings. It just looks like he had a really good year. And he's trying to manage that money, that bumper crop. I grew up in Fresno. It's all about agriculture. And this seems like a smart, hey, you get a lot of extra stuff. You want to save it up for maybe next year won't be so good. You're going to need twice as much. You never know. Looks like he's just being shrewd. He's going to build bigger barns and make sure he's got it all set up so he's set for the future. Isn't that what most advisors would tell you to do? Isn't that what, for those of us who have financial advisors? Mine doesn't like me very much. But, we have these people that tell us, it's all about saving up so that when you can retire, you don't want to just retire. You want to be able to retire and have lots of money. You can travel. You can do whatever you want to. You can give your kids stuff. You can give your grandkids stuff. And it's all about, making sure you're all set up for that. And when I point out to my financial advisor, well, that's not the way I make decisions. She just doesn't really know how to respond to that. Well, no, this is what you do. Well, we don't. Why, she just doesn't get it. You see, Christians work off a different paradigm, or we should. What's the problem here? From a worldly standpoint, he is making wise decisions. From a worldly standpoint, he's not a bad guy. He doesn't mistreat his workers. He's been blessed by God, you might say. And he decides to build bigger barns, store it up so he can be set for life. That just almost sounds like the American dream. You see, the problem is he's making his plans without God in mind. He's making his plans without his neighbors in mind. I love that illustration. I've given it before, but it's been a while, where the professor talks to the young student and says, what are your plans? He says, well, I want to graduate, and then I want to get a graduate degree and go into business. And he said, well, then what? And he said, well, I want to start my own company, and I want to make a lot of money, and then, maybe set up some investments, maybe become part of a corporation. And then what? Well, then once I own the corporation, I'm going to do this. And well, and then what? Well, then I'll retire and travel all over the world. And he said, well, and then what? And he said, well, I guess I'll die. And he said, and then what? He said, well, I haven't really thought about that. He goes, well, then I suggest you rethink your life. You see, if we haven't thought about that last and then what, it's quite possible our plans are a little more worldly than they should be. But God wants us to consider Him. What are the two greatest commandments? Love God, love your neighbor. This particular individual Jesus refers to as a fool because he has made his plans without talking to God about it and without considering his neighbors. And in this society at that time, most people were on a subsistence living day to day. And that if one particular person was blessed, I know in Kenya, in a village situation, the expectation was that you would share that blessing with especially those who's maybe had a bad crop that year. If someone's cows expanded, his herd doubled, they were expected to sort of toss a few cows around to those who maybe had some problems. That was just what a good neighbor would do. And they understood that then. Landowners started making plans without any consideration for God and without any consideration for what God would was doing. Yes, he was blessed by God. And what we've always talked about, anytime God gives you something as a blessing, he expects you to give it out. Anything flowing down from God is expected to go out. We are blessed so that we can bless others. And I can't think of a better time of year to talk about this, because we have been richly blessed. God said to him, "Fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be?" In other words, some people spend a lot of time accumulating as much stuff as possible and then die in the middle of it. And all that stuff they've accumulated just gets handed out or fought over by somebody else. Here's another illustration I think very poignant. I've used it before, but I just, when I read these passages, I go back to it. A friend of mine did a research project where he went around and interviewed people in several of the really nice retirement homes, Beverly Hills, Bel Air. And his question was, what would you have done different? These were people who were worth millions. And he just was interviewing each one of them, saying, looking back over your life, I mean, you've achieved all the success by any American standard, by any worldly standard, but you are a successful person. Is there something you would have done differently? As he pointed out, he said, not one of them says, "I wish I'd made just one more million." None of them said, "I wish I'd taken over one more company." He said almost all of them said, maybe if I had spent a little more time with my family, they'd come spend a little more time with me right now. In spite of all their wealth, living in some incredibly nice retirement places, they recognized that at the end of it all, the treasure was with the people they loved the most. And I don't care how much or how little you have, if you don't understand that, especially as a Christian, you're really missing the point. The two greatest commands are to love God and love your neighbor, because that's the way we're wired. If we'll do those two things, we will have everything. That's the message of the passage. And what you have as far as possessions is just side benefit, icing on the cake. Make sure you've got the relationships based on an understanding of who God is, become who you're supposed to be, and share that love with those closest to you. Don't be anxious about your life. Therefore, I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what will you eat, or about your body and what you will put on. I know there's some women in the audience that are having trouble with that passage. For life is more than food, and the body is more than clothing. And let's keep it in context. I strongly recommend clothing, okay? But life is much more than that. Jesus is pointing out how you dress. And again, this, you think, well, this is first century Israel, right? Oh my goodness, their fashion statements were just as loud and just as arrogant and just as gaudy as any of ours is today. They had ways of dressing up. I think one of the biggest problems Jesus had with the Pharisees was that their very rules required you to be rich. You couldn't do the stuff they all had to do to stay pure without being pretty wealthy, which meant poor people just couldn't even qualify as Pharisees. You had to be pretty well off. And so Jesus goes into this statement about the ravens and the lilies. He's just sort of saying, look at nature. God takes care of the birds. God dresses the flowers of the field with incredible splendor. And these things are here and gone. Nothing illustrated this point better to me. I've told this story before. It's a part of my own spiritual formation, but when I was 15, my house burned down, and I was blamed for it. And at the time, I thought it was the most horrible thing that could have ever happened to me. I considered suicide quite seriously. But I look back on that event, and what happened was I sort of had to take God seriously. I looked down at my Bible and thought, look, I either need to kill myself or actually believe what this thing says. And with my house burning down, I realized everything you own can go up in smoke in 2 hours. I mean, we lost everything. We dragged some furniture out into the front yard, but it was so hot and the fire was so hot that the furniture melted in the front yard. We lost everything. And I realized I don't want to spend my life trying to accumulate things that can disappear in 2 hours. It's not worth it. Do we need some things? Sure. But boy, if that's what life is all about, we've missed the point. Just don't worry about these things. God takes care of the birds and the flowers. He will take care of his people. And yet, how much time do we spend worrying? I don't know if God laughs or cries when he hears me worrying about finances. He has always blessed us incredibly. We need to recognize that. Do not seek what you are to eat and what you are to drink, or be worried, for all the nations of the world seek after these things. And your Father knows you need them. And like any decent father, if he knows you need them, he will provide them. It's just not even a question. Now, he may not provide it in the color you want it. He may not provide it in the type of vehicle you needed, you thought you needed. It may not be the same kind of house you were looking for. We need to understand he provides what we need, not what we want. Because he knows we don't always want what we actually need. We wouldn't grow otherwise. Now, most of us are way past subsistence living. We don't worry about, where's my food going to come from? Where's the next meal? And again, we knew people like that, and a lot of the people in Kenya have jobs where they get paid by the day. And they show up, and sometimes they need you, and sometimes they don't, and that's the difference between taking food home that night or not. Most Americans are way past that. Fact is, if you don't have any food, there's places you can go and they'll give you food. That's the kind of country and that's the kind of blessings that we've received here. We're past that, but we still worry, don't we? We complained about in Kenya they ate what's called ugali. It's corn mush. Usually they threw in some veggies on the side, and that's what they ate every day. And the missionaries would sit there and talk about, oh gosh, I got to eat some more ugali. The Kenyans didn't have the luck. They praised God if they got the same thing every day. Learn to appreciate what we have. We sit there and, oh gee, steak and shrimp again. Oh my gosh. We need to understand how blessed we are. In fact, the problem in America is we have so much food available to us, we have to go to the gym to try to get rid of what we have. There's so many places in the world that would love to have a problem like that. Invest in the kingdom, and here's the real message here. Instead, seek his kingdom, and these things will be added to you. Fear not, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. You see, it's a matter of perspective, and all through Scripture, it just keeps repeating the fact that perspective is everything. It's not how much you have. It's not the things you do. It's not the bank account. It's your perspective on them. Do you recognize it as a blessing from God and use it to bless other people? And that has little to do with how much or how little you have. It has to do with your perspective and what you're willing to share. And when we consider our time on earth versus our time with God in eternity, and again, perspective. You start to get your mind wrapped around eternity in the presence of God versus the 80 or 90 years we have here. You know, I used to think, gosh, it'd be fun. I'd love to live to 100, but I got to tell you, at 57, I'm already tired, I'm ready to move on and be with God because I know that's going to be way better. I mean, Paul figured that out. I don't know whether to stay or go because, boy, I'd really like to go and be with God, but I'll stick around if God wants me to minister to his people. We need to understand eternity with God is what we're aiming for, and how we live now has a whole lot to do with then. It's connected. And I do like what he says here. This is unique to Luke, but he says, for it's your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. So many people have this idea that God's looking to catch us doing something wrong and throw us out. And you're waiting for that referee's whistle, whoop, foul. And he's pointing out, no, that's not who God is. God, it's his good pleasure to give you the kingdom. If you'll seek it, and he says seek it, but we think, we got to get a treasure map, and we got to travel around the world and hike the Himalayas and go across the ocean. No, if you'll just seek it, he'll drop it in front of you. Seek the kingdom. It's his good pleasure to give you the kingdom. He's a father. Do we get that? He's dad. He wants to give it to you. But he wants to make sure you're going to do what's right with it. He wants to make sure I'm going to receive it with gratitude, that I'm going to receive it as the treasure that it is and treat it that way, and that I'm going to represent it to the world in his image and not mine. He wants to give us the kingdom. Conclusion? Where your treasure is, there your heart will be. It's one thing to say, I love God, and I'm all about my faith. The real question is, does your daytimer display that? Does our checkbook display that? Because I think two of the most valuable things to most Americans is our time and our money. And if those don't reflect investment in the kingdom, then all the words and platitudes won't mean anything. And I can tell you there's some people around here that have really encouraged me. There's some people that have just been throwing themselves into helping out with everything around this church building, with this congregation, with our programs. There are people that are just constantly down here looking for ways to help. And some of them are quite wealthy. And some of them aren't. But you can see where their treasure's at. You can see they're investing in the kingdom. Because it's not about how much or how little we have. It's about where we are putting our treasure. So especially at this time of year, Ask yourself that. I have to ask myself that. Where are we putting our treasure? Are we putting it in the people around us? Are we loving God and loving our neighbor? Or are we just trying to accumulate more stuff? Because our culture says that's okay to live for stuff. It encourages. I mean, that's what advertising's all about. But that's not what Christianity is all about. That's certainly not what our Father is all about. So this week, the rest of this year, next year, let's invest in the kingdom of God and let these things be added to us. Whatever your needs are this morning, please come as we stand and sing.